Imagine you are in a huge stone fortress, and the temperature inside is lower than outside. A blizzard rages outside the walls, and inside the icy air burns your lungs. Even the thickest stone walls cannot retain heat, and the massive doors and tiny windows only exacerbate the situation. Every breath turns into a cloud of steam, and you can feel the cold penetrating every cell of your body. This is not an excerpt from a fantasy novel or movie. It is the reality that the inhabitants of European castles faced for many centuries. The castles we see today as majestic architectural monuments were actually harsh, cold, and gloomy places, especially in winter. Today, we will reveal the truth about how people lived in these icy fortresses, why they were so difficult to heat, and what tricks they used to keep from freezing. Medieval castles were built primarily as defensive structures, not as comfortable dwellings. Their main purpose was to protect against enemies, not the cold. The thick stone walls, which were designed to withstand the blows of battering rams and siege weapons, actually functioned as powerful heat sinks. Stone is excellent at conducting and retaining low temperatures. If it was freezing outside, the walls inside the castle would also become icy. This cold armor prevented the heat generated inside from accumulating. The huge halls with high ceilings designed for ceremonial receptions and feasts were almost impossible to heat. All the warm air immediately rose and escaped through cracks in the roof and tiny windows. The ventilation, which was necessary to remove smoke from open hearths, only exacerbated the draft effect. Therefore, the air in the castle constantly circulated and the heat did not linger. In addition to the obvious heating problems, the very architecture of the castles created additional difficulties. The massive stone arches and floors not only retained the cold, but also slowly but surely released it into the space, creating a feeling of constant chill. The floor was especially icy, as it was in direct contact with the ground. The cold rose from below, and even thick boots did not always protect against the penetrating chill. Footwear at that time was simple and did not have effective thermal insulation, which made standing on the stone floor even more unbearable. The location of castles on high ground, which was strategically advantageous from a defensive point of view, also made them vulnerable to the winds. Gusts of wind penetrated through narrow loopholes and cracks in the doors, creating drafts that were impossible to hide from. These drafts constantly stirred the air in the rooms, preventing it from warming up even from the hearths. In winter, the air in the castle was so cold that you could see your breath, and breathing felt heavy and icy. In such conditions, even simple everyday tasks became a test of endurance. The construction technologies of the time did not allow for the creation of airtight structures. The mortar used to bind the stones crumbled over time, leaving small gaps and cracks. These gaps, initially invisible, became channels for cold air, which penetrated the walls and cooled them even more. The windows in the castles, which were small and had no glass, were closed with wooden shutters, but even these did not provide a complete seal. They were often made of roughly hewn boards, which warped over time, forming gaps between them. Winter days in the castle were short and gloomy. Light penetrated only through narrow loopholes and small windows. This created an atmosphere not only of cold, but also of constant semi-darkness. Torches and candles were used for additional lighting, but they provided little light and heat and burned out quickly. Life in such conditions required incredible resilience. Every night and every day was a challenge, and people were constantly looking for ways to withstand the elements. They didn't just want to survive, they sought at least some semblance of comfort. Life in a castle in winter was inherently associated with constant cold. Even during meals or socializing, people had to wear their outer clothing. Castle baths or hot water vats were rare and only available to the most high-ranking individuals. Therefore, hygiene procedures were carried out in cold conditions, which made them even more unpleasant. All of life was subordinated to the struggle for warmth, from sleep and wakefulness to eating. Share in the comments which medieval castle you would choose if you knew you would have to spend a cold winter there, and write what you think was the most effective way to keep warm. The simplest and most obvious way to heat a room was with an open hearth in the middle of the main hall. Wood was placed in the hearth, which burned, spreading heat and light. However, this method was extremely inefficient. First, an open fire did not provide much heat, and smoke filled the entire room. Despite the openings in the roof, smoke settled on the walls and objects, creating a persistent smell and soot. Later, wall-mounted fireplaces appeared. They were more efficient because the smoke went out through a pipe in the wall instead of rising upward. However, they had their own problems. Fireplaces only provided heat nearby. The further you moved away from the fire, the colder it got. In addition, heating the castle required a huge amount of firewood. Entire wood piles could be burned in a single day. Delivering and storing such a large amount of fuel was a separate problem. The lack of heat from the fireplaces meant that the castle's inhabitants were forced to stay close to the source of the fire. During the cold months, all life was concentrated in 1 or 2 rooms where the hearths burned. This meant that personal space was virtually unavailable, and people lived in constant crowding. Even the owners of the castle, unlike in movies, could not enjoy privacy in their bedrooms, because it was just as cold there as everywhere else. The family, servants, and guests all gathered around the fireplace to keep warm, which created both social and domestic difficulties. Preparing firewood was one of the most important tasks. In summer and autumn, people worked hard to provide themselves with fuel for the whole winter. Huge wood piles were stacked in the courtyards of castles, and their size could say a lot about the wealth of the owner. If the firewood supplies ran out ahead of time, it could lead to a real disaster. During a siege or a prolonged snowstorm, when it was impossible to deliver new fuel, the castle was in danger of freezing completely. Burning wood was not only a source of heat, but also a symbol of life and safety. In addition to firewood, peat, which gave off more heat but produced more smoke, or coal, which was more efficient but much more expensive and difficult to obtain, could be burned in the hearths. The use of these alternative fuels depended on the geographical location of the castle. However, firewood remained the main fuel for centuries, dictating the entire way of life. Chimneys, which were supposed to remove smoke, often became clogged with soot and required regular cleaning. This process was laborious and dangerous. Constant smoke in the rooms, even with a fireplace, was a serious problem. It not only stained the walls and clothes, but also had a negative impact on health. Soot settled on furniture, books, and tapestries. The persistent smell of smoke permeated everything: clothes, hair, skin. This smell was an integral part of life in the castle, and it was impossible to get rid of it. Even dishes and cooked food smelled of smoke to some extent. Despite all these difficulties, people continued to search for solutions. This constant striving for comfort and warmth is so characteristic of human beings, but it has not always been easy to achieve. What if we lived in a world where warmth was not a given, but a luxury that had to be fought for every day? What would we be willing to give up for a single day spent in warmth? To find out what other unexpected solutions people came up with, watch the video to the end. Since it was almost impossible to heat the air in the castle, people focused on at least insulating themselves from the cold. One of the most effective solutions was tapestries and thick woolen curtains. These dense woven fabrics were hung on the walls to create an additional layer of insulation. Tapestries not only protected against the cold, but also helped to retain heat inside small, isolated spaces. They were hung on stone walls to reduce heat loss, and were also used to create improvised rooms inside large halls. For example, in the bedroom, tapestries were hung around the bed to create a kind of tent. This way, people did not have to heat the entire room, but only a small space around themselves. This solution was not only practical, but also prestigious. Creating tapestries was a laborious and expensive process, so their presence indicated the wealth of the castle's owner. And the more tapestries hung on the walls, the warmer and cozier the room was. The use of tapestries as thermal insulation was a brilliant but necessary solution. The castle's thick, massive stone walls were constantly cold because they could not warm up quickly from the fire. They served as a kind of refrigerator that constantly drew heat from the air. To counteract this, people hung wool and linen cloths on the walls, which served as a barrier between the cold stone and the living space. This not only helped to retain heat, but also created an illusion of comfort and coziness. Tapestries and curtains also played an important role in dividing large rooms into zones. In huge rooms where people ate, slept, and worked, these woven partitions helped create small, warmer areas. For example, curtains could separate the sleeping area from the rest of the hall, allowing body heat to be retained in a confined space. This room within a room principle was essential for ensuring a minimum level of comfort. In addition, tapestries helped to hide gaps in the walls and windows through which cold air penetrated. In addition to tapestries, other woven items were also used. Thick woolen blankets and throws were draped over shoulders and knees, and were also used to provide additional warmth for beds. Fur skins, which were even more effective at retaining heat, were used as rugs on the floor, as bedspreads, and even as linings for clothing. These items not only served a practical purpose, but were also a symbol of wealth. The more fur and expensive fabrics there were in the castle, the higher the status of its owner. The production of tapestries was a true art form. Weavers worked for weeks and sometimes months on a single piece, using complex techniques and expensive dyes. The intricate patterns and historical scenes depicted on tapestries transformed them from simple insulation into works of art. These items were passed down from generation to generation, becoming family heirlooms. But their practical purpose was never forgotten. Castle owners kept entire inventory lists of tapestries and curtains so that they could be quickly moved if necessary, for example, when moving to another residence or during military operations. Interestingly, the practice of using textiles for insulation continued for many centuries, even after the advent of more sophisticated heating systems. Tapestries continued to adorn the walls of castles and palaces, but their original function as a means of combating the cold remained in history. Initially, they were not just a decoration, but a necessity of life that helped people survive in harsh conditions. They were a kind of shield against the piercing cold that penetrated every corner of the castle. As a result, tapestries and curtains became not only a decorative element, but also a symbol of human ingenuity and the desire to survive. They proved that even in the most unfavorable conditions, people found a way to create acceptable conditions for themselves. Studying the history of castles, we see that behind their massive walls lay not only power and authority, but also a constant struggle with nature. Unlike open hearths and fireplaces, stoves were a much more efficient way of heating. They were closed structures made of stone or brick, where the fire burned inside and the heat from the hot walls was transferred to the room. The smoke escaped through the chimney without polluting the air. Stoves first appeared in what is now Germany and Scandinavia, where the climate was particularly harsh. However, their spread was slow. The reason was that stoves required a more complex design than simple fireplaces. It was necessary to think through a system of chimneys, which did not always fit into existing castle structures. Nevertheless, stoves offered many advantages. They could retain heat for a long time after the fire had gone out and heat the room evenly. Over time, stoves began to be made of tiles, which not only accumulated heat but also decorated the interior. The introduction of stoves into castle architecture was a real breakthrough. New castles, which were built in later periods, were originally designed with stove heating in mind. In such castles, chimneys were laid inside the walls, which allowed the heat to be evenly distributed throughout the different rooms. In addition to stationary stoves, there were other options. In some regions of Europe, mobile stoves were used, which could be moved from one room to another, which was especially convenient in large castles, where it was unprofitable to heat all rooms at once. These stoves were smaller in size and did not have a complex chimney system, which made them less efficient but more flexible in use. They were most often installed in small rooms or in the Lord's chambers, where more heat was required. The tiles used to cover the stoves were not only beautiful, but also very practical. They were made of fired clay and had a high heat capacity, which allowed them to retain heat for a long time and release it into the room. Tiles were often decorated with intricate patterns, heraldic symbols, and scenes from everyday life, turning the stove into a true work of art. This was further proof that even the most practical items in a castle had to match the status of its owner. Despite all their advantages, stoves did not become a universal solution. Many old castles simply could not be converted to stove heating, and the owners did not want to spend huge sums on reconstruction. In addition, high-quality fuel was required to fire the stoves, which was not always available. Fireplaces, despite their inefficiency, were simpler and cheaper to install and operate. That is why fireplaces and open hearths continued to dominate castles for centuries. But why did stoves not become a widespread solution in castles? And what solution was better than stoves? We will find out very soon. Don't switch off the video. In addition to fundamental solutions, such as tapestries and stoves, people resorted to a variety of little tricks to keep warm. For example, they placed heated stones or vessels with hot water in their beds. This allowed them to warm up their beds before going to sleep and not freeze at night. Woolen blankets and fur skins were also widely used, serving not only for warmth, but also for additional insulation. They were thrown over chairs, laid on the floor to avoid standing on cold stone, and, of course, wrapped around people. Fur was especially valuable because it retained heat very well. Another way to keep warm was simply to gather together. People spent their evenings in one large room with a burning hearth. The heat generated by many bodies helped to maintain the temperature. And of course, we mustn't forget about warm food and drinks, which warmed people up from the inside, at least for a while. These small but very important tricks helped people survive the harshest frosts. For example, heated stones were a simple and affordable method. Stones heated in the hearth were wrapped in cloth to avoid burns and placed in bed. They slowly gave off heat, warming the bed and allowing the person to fall asleep. Over time, stones were replaced by ceramic hot water bottles filled with hot water. This was a more convenient and safer solution. Some historical documents mention that servants prepared such hot water bottles for their masters before bedtime. Fur skins were a real luxury, but their practicality was undeniable. They were used for everything from floor coverings to bedspreads. Fox, bear, and sable skins were especially prized because they were very warm. Even the wealthiest people did not shy away from using fur in their daily lives, because it was not just a luxury, but a necessity. Skins were often placed on chairs near fireplaces so that those sitting on them would not feel the cold of the stone, which even clothing could not protect against. Gathering together around the hearth was not only a social, but also a purely practical decision. The heat emitted by the bodies created a kind of microclimate in the room. This allowed them to save firewood and maintain a temperature that was slightly higher than in other parts of the castle. On cold winter nights, people often slept in one large room to keep warm. This applied not only to the nobility, but also to their servants, who often slept directly on the floor in their master's chambers so that their body heat would help maintain the temperature. This was not a sign of disrespect, but a necessary measure. Warm food and drinks also played an important role. Hot soups, stewed meat, and hot wine or ale helped to warm people up from the inside. Castles always prepared a lot of food, which was not only nutritious, but also hot. This was especially important during cold spells. Hot ale or wine was drunk to keep warm and also for disinfection, as water was often cold. Another trick was to use thick pillows and wool blankets. Wool is an excellent insulator and was used in large quantities. Pillows stuffed with wool were placed not only under the head, but also under the back to protect against the cold stone walls. Layering was a key principle. People wore many layers of clothing and used several blankets in bed to create an air gap that retained heat. These little tricks, accumulated over centuries, helped people not only survive, but also make their lives in the icy fortresses a little more bearable. Many historical chronicles and letters from that time tell of the unbearable cold in castles. For example, the Chronicles of the French Kings contain records of how courtiers complained about the piercing cold in the Louvre, which at that time was not yet a palace in the modern sense. There is evidence that frozen rivers were used as roads in winter, and ice in castles was not uncommon. Reports and inventory lists from that time often mention large quantities of firewood, which indicates constant attempts to heat the premises. Some castles even had special rooms that were heated only in winter. Documents preserved from those times mention that in some castles, even the water in jugs standing in the chambers froze in winter. This suggests that the temperature inside the rooms could drop below zero. Windows made of thin mica or parchment, and often absent altogether, let in the cold and wind, making life even more unbearable. People tried to spend as much time as possible in the kitchen, where a large hearth burned and food was prepared. It was one of the warmest places in the castle, and it was always bustling with activity. The extent to which people suffered from the cold can be judged from their letters and diaries. Many complained of constant colds and joint pain caused by the unbearable conditions. The cold was not just a discomfort, but a serious threat to health. There are preserved references to how lords and their families, returning from trips, immediately headed for the fireplace and demanded that hot wine or ale be brought to them to warm up. Interestingly, only the rooms where meals were taken and the lord and lady's chambers were heated. The rest of the castle, including the guest rooms, servants' bedrooms, and even the armory, remained cold. This was because firewood supplies were limited and had to be conserved. During the cold season, many servants preferred to sleep in the Great Hall, where the fireplace was lit, or in their own rooms, covered with all the blankets and furs they could find. Castles were not only military structures, but also centers of government and trade. They were used to hold court, receive ambassadors, and conclude deals. But all these important matters had to be conducted in conditions that seem unacceptable to us today. Even during formal receptions, when many people gathered, the temperature in the hall was so low that guests did not take off their cloaks and fur capes. Cold was a constant backdrop to all events taking place in the castle. Another indication of the cold was the inventory lists. They often specified the amount of firewood that had to be prepared for the winter, which emphasizes how important a resource it was. In addition, the inventories mention a large number of blankets, skins, and tapestries that were used for warmth. These were not just household items, but vital things that helped people survive. Of course, in such conditions, people could not expect the comforts we are accustomed to. Nevertheless, they did not give up and continued to look for ways to keep warm. And one of those ways was fashion. But how can fashion keep you warm? Watch until the end to find out why it was customary to dress like a cabbage in the Middle Ages. Clothing played a key role in survival. Unlike the light and elegant outfits we see in movies, real medieval clothing was layered and warm. People wore several layers of linen and wool undergarments. Outerwear was made of thick, heavy fabrics. In winter, people often wore fur linings under their clothes. Fur coats and cloaks were an integral part of the wardrobe. Mittens and headwear were important not only for outdoors, but also indoors. Even during formal receptions and feasts, people sat in their warm cloaks because the halls were so cold that it was impossible to survive without them. Clothing was not only a way to express one's status, but also a necessity of life. The most important principle was layering. Under the outer clothing, several layers of linen and woolen shirts were worn, which created an airy layer. This layer acted as a heat insulator, preventing body heat from escaping. The shirts were made of linen, which was softer and more comfortable against the skin, and woolen tunics were worn over them to better retain heat. Outerwear was particularly heavy and thick. Cloaks and capes were made of thick wool, often with the addition of fur, and were an essential part of the wardrobe. Men wore long tunics, knee-length or longer, and women wore long dresses. These outfits were not the most comfortable for active movement, but they provided excellent protection from the cold. The clothes were not only warm, but also durable, as they were made to last for centuries. The materials were expensive, so the clothes were cherished, repaired, and passed down from generation to generation. Fur was a real luxury, but it was used not only for decoration, but also for warmth. Fur-lined coats were worn under cloaks. Fur was used to line collars, sleeves, and hems of clothing, which helped to retain heat. Sometimes they even used fur stockings, which were worn under shoes to keep feet warm on cold stone floors. Fur was a symbol of wealth and status, but its main purpose was purely practical, to keep its owner warm. Headwear and mittens were an integral part of the winter wardrobe. It was so cold indoors that people did not take off their headwear. They were not only a fashion accessory, but also protection from drafts and the cold that penetrated through the walls. Mittens helped keep hands warm when a person was writing, working, or simply sitting by the hearth. Interestingly, clothing was not only warm, but also dark in color. This was because dark fabrics absorbed sunlight better and heated up faster. In addition, dirt was less noticeable on dark clothing, which was especially important in conditions where clothes were rarely washed. Thus, medieval fashion was dictated not only by aesthetic preferences, but also by the harsh necessity of survival. Every layer of clothing, every element, from thick cloaks to fur linings, had its own function. People dressed to protect themselves from the constant cold, which was an integral part of their lives in stone castles. Nighttime in the castle was the coldest time of the day. Most of the hearths were extinguished, and the temperature inside dropped to critical levels. People went to bed wearing several layers of clothing. Sometimes they slept directly in their furs. The bed was the warmest place. It was usually placed away from the cold walls, and curtains around the bed created a kind of insulating dome. To keep warm, people slept together, gathering in one bed to share their warmth. In wealthy homes, servants even slept on the floor in their master's room so that their warmth would help maintain the temperature in the room. This was not only a custom, but also a necessity. For the inhabitants of the castle, sleep was not just rest, but a real test of cold. As soon as the fire in the hearth died down, the temperature dropped sharply. Without a constant source of heat, the massive stone walls and floors quickly cooled, turning into icy surfaces. People prepared for the night in advance. They wrapped themselves in several layers of clothing, put on thick woolen stockings, and even wore hats to keep their heads warm. The bed as the main tool for survival at night was constructed in a special way. Its frame was often made of wood so that it would not conduct cold. The bed was stuffed with straw or feathers, and several layers of woolen blankets and fur skins were laid on top. The curtains around the bed, which we mentioned earlier, were not just a decorative element. They created a mini tent that retained the heat emitted by the sleeping person's body. Thanks to this, a person did not have to heat the entire huge room, but only a small space inside the bed. Another practice was sleeping together. This applied not only to spouses, but to the whole family. Several people could sleep in one bed to share the warmth. This practice was not unusual, but rather a necessary measure. Servants slept in the same way, often lying on the floor in one room to create a stove effect. This was absolutely normal, dictated by harsh reality. The more people in one room, the warmer it was. In addition to the physical cold, there was also psychological discomfort. The darkness and cold in the castle could create a feeling of isolation. The creaking of the wind in the walls and the howling in the pipes seemed to intensify the feeling of loneliness and vulnerability. Therefore, people preferred to sleep in large groups. This not only helped to keep warm, but also gave a feeling of security. Thus, sleeping in a castle was a science in itself. People used all the means available to them: layers of clothing, thick curtains, hot water bottles, and of course, each other's warmth. All these measures helped them survive the darkest and coldest hours, so that when morning came, they could once again begin the struggle for survival within the icy walls. Now that you know how cold it really was in medieval castles, which of these ways of keeping warm do you think was the most effective? And if you had a choice, which would you prefer? A warm and cozy room or a spacious but cold hall? Write your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new videos about the most interesting historical facts. Also, if you have any ideas for future videos, share them in the comments. We are always looking for new topics and stories to tell you about. We are interested in everything from everyday life in ancient Rome to the daily life of the Vikings.